Hello, friends, and welcome back to r/ProRevenge. In the first story, our OP's boss pissed him off so much that he gave him a heart attack. But before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to our channel if you're new here, and turn on notifications so you don't miss a new video every single day. I have a new boss. Many moons ago, mid-90s, I worked for an ISP, not in the US nor Europe, looking after various back-end systems. There were two of us on the same team. What's weird is that they went through a mini restructure and we both had different bosses, even though we did the same work and shared the load between us. I was single at the time and lived about 5 minutes drive from the office. My official office hours were 8:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. Becomes relevant later. Often stayed until after 7 p.m. to do work, learn new Unix things, troubleshoot major issues. At some point, I decided my old car was past its prime, so I bought another one. I sent my boss a number of emails about how the following week I was going to take a longer lunch as the car would be ready for collection/trading in the old one. I also told him about it twice the week before the collection date. CYA, people. Day of collection, everything's great. Took 2 hours to get the paperwork all sorted out, hoping car is an absolute magnet for the opposite sex. Off I go. 2 days later, I get called into a meeting and get absolutely crapped on about why did I take such a long lunch. Boss needed me for something, but I wasn't there. This was in days pre-mobiles being readily available. I was upset. Tried to tell him I told him I was taking a long lunch, kept interrupting me and shouting over me. I left super annoyed. So I started working my official hours. After the second day, I get a phone call at home, company had numbers in case of emergency, at 5 p.m. It's boss asking where I am. Told him I'd left for the day and was at home about to fire up Red Alert on my PC. He told me that was unacceptable and needed me to do something. How could I leave him at this time? Blah, blah. He shouted he's getting HR involved. I told him it was unacceptable to talk to me like that and we can address this issue the next day at work, and hung up on him. Thanks, Mom, for helping me get a strong backbone to do that. Nearly wet myself. Next day, HR, CEO, and my boss call me into a meeting. I knew this was coming and had printed off the emails about taking long lunch. Boss goes off on me about disrespect, lack of performance, taking long lunches, etc. I showed the email, explained the situation, and asked what's the issue. At this point, I thought he was going to have a heart attack. He was so angry and red in the face. CEO asked me to leave the meeting. They would discuss. Outcome was I got the same manager my coworker reported into. Everything went back to being great. Karma being a B, my ex-boss actually did have a heart attack a few months later. He survived but changed his ways. A lot less alcohol and smoking. And our second story. I'm suspended? You're fired. Several years ago, I used to work at a shipping warehouse. I was 19 when this story took place, and I had been there for about a year. The way this place operated was that they would have about 100 to 200 employees at any given time, with shifts changing out every 4 hours to cycle through everyone. It wasn't the best company to work for, but I was still new to the workforce, and at the time I was just happy to be getting a paycheck so I could buy things. I came in one day and one of the site leads had gone into labor, so she was on maternity leave for a while. Apparently, this wasn't expected to happen so soon because the other leads were all scrambling to get her shift covered. They covered the shift when they could, but eventually hired a temp manager who we'll call Jeff for the sake of this story. It became obvious very early on that this guy had some sort of complex, because as soon as he was introduced, he ran the employees there like a tyrant. Imagine the drill sergeant from Full Metal Jacket, but even meaner, and with no idea of what he was doing. Naturally, I had the misfortune to work the shift he was in charge of. We all noticed that he was just assigning people to different stations almost at random, regardless if they were trained to work it or not. But I don't think anyone said anything because they were too afraid or something. I still have no idea why, but for some reason the other site leads and HR left him totally off the leash and unsupervised as soon as they introduced him to us. Before this guy had started, I'd been speaking with HR and my team supervisor about applying to be one of the site's delivery drivers, and they directed me to the dispatch desk to apply. Well, one day I did that on my break, and Jeff came up to me screaming about how I was wasting his time and that he didn't pay me just to sit there and chat with people. I told him that I'd already gotten the okay from HR, and they actually directed me to have this discussion. Plus, I was on my break, so I wasn't even on the clock. This guy wasn't having it. He said that I could either go do what he told me to do, or he would write me up. Again, I tried to explain that I was on my scheduled break, but he just cut me off. He said I was suspended until further notice, which wasn't even something the company did. I asked if I could finish applying for the position as the delivery driver, and he lost his crap. He kept saying for me to get out of his building and that he had better never see me again. At first, I was freaking out, thinking I'd just been fired. I thought to myself, he can't do this to me. Then I saw my team supervisor approaching after hearing the yelling. He just stood there, and when Jeff was done, he smiled and nodded at me, and it clicked. He actually can't do this to me. I'd never gotten any write-ups before, and I was actually one of the top performers on my shift. This guy couldn't fire me without any write-ups or a proper HR investigation. I instantly calmed down, realizing that I wasn't the one who would end up being fired. I just shrugged, said okay, and went home, knowing the company didn't have any kind of suspension penalty and figuring the time would be taken out of my vacation pay or something. About 5 days later, I got the call I was expecting from the warehouse's HR department asking me to come back. Apparently, my team supervisor and several others from the shift reported Jeff for mistreating the employees and going against the warehouse's safety guidelines, and he was fired. I grinned, realizing the position I was in now, and told them I wanted to be paid at the overtime rate for the days I was forced to take off, and I didn't want any of it to affect my attendance, which they agreed to after a bit of grumbling. When I got back, Jeff was nowhere to be found, and the night shift site lead had taken over for the morning shift as well. I didn't get to be a delivery driver, but the paycheck for that week was almost double what I usually got. And I got a bonus at the end of that month for perfect attendance. I left the job a few months later due to a different unrelated issue. And our last story. Your company is mine now. Cast. Me, David, my brother, Tony. Tony owns a medical IT company. Let's call them IT Docs. Well, IT Docs was just starting quite a few years ago when it secured what was to be one of its biggest contracts ever. It was a major milestone for Tony and IT Docs. However, Tony needed some assistance to properly execute on the contract. Tony approached another company called, making this up, BSOB IT, ran by a Mr. Liar. Tony and Mr. Liar had several meetings in which Tony outlined the contract and his plan of action and where he'd need Mr. Liar's assistance. Mr. Liar listened and verbally committed that BSOB IT could help and would be more than happy to help, but needed more information. Tony gave Mr. Liar the information and thought everything was just fine when one day the doctor's office called up my brother Tony and said they'd no longer be interested in the contract and had just signed a deal with BSOB IT. Tony was PO'd. He came to me for advice. I'm not sure if this was good advice, but the way I saw it, he was just a lightweight in the game and got shafted by a heavyweight. If he went after BSOB IT and Mr. Liar today, it could massively backfire. I told Tony he needs to toss this way in the bin and focus on growth, not revenge. He then said to me, "You're right, but one day, I'll get them." Tony went on to grow IT Docs into a thriving company. When one day he'd become so large, he decided the most economical way to grow was to acquire his competition, and he set his eyes on BSOB IT. In that time, BSOB IT had lost several key contracts and was quite a bit smaller than it was since the days of the meetings between Mr. Liar and my brother Tony. However, my brother decided to acquire this company. I suspect it had a lot to do with the righting the injustice of yesterday tomorrow type deal. Now, Tony was very smart in his approach. He put one of his most senior partners to be the face of the acquisition. He even went so far as to accidentally remove his picture from the CEO founder portion of the company's website. He figured that no way would Mr. Liar remember IT Docs and wouldn't suspect a thing. Well, he successfully bought out BSOB IT, and Mr. Liar was still their CEO. However, there's no need for two CEOs now, is there? Tony invited Mr. Liar to discuss the role that he'll play with IT Docs. I guess Mr. Liar assumed that he'd retain his position and benefits, but there was no need for two CEOs. So as my brother said, Mr. Liar and him went over how the company would be structured, and then Tony asked Mr. Liar, "Where do you see yourself in this organization?" Now those meetings lasted for a while, over the course of several days. What struck Tony is Mr. Liar never remembered their first encounters and how Mr. Liar stole his client until then the final meeting, something clicked, and Mr. Liar said to my brother, "Didn't we do business together before?" My brother smirked and said, "Yes, we have." Mr. Liar said, "I can't seem to recall. Do you?" My brother smiled back and said, "Do you remember when in year XXXX, a small startup medical IT company came to your company for assistance with a Mr. X doctor's office?" Mr. Liar's getting uncomfortable in his chair and said, "Yeah." My brother went on to say, "Well, we never did much business together because after we discussed being partners, that doctor's office called me up and said they were no longer doing business with me and have chosen your company over mine, even though you didn't even see the opportunity until I asked for your company's partnership on the deal." Mr. Liar was still pretty sure he already knew what was up. My brother then said, "Now, Mr. Liar, my partners and senior management have discussed what role and what skill set you bring to the table. We simply don't see the need for your continued service in our organization and will be ending your employment with us." With that, Mr. Liar left the company for good. And before people bash my brother, Mr. Liar really didn't bring anything to the table besides being a businessman with questionable ethics and extremely outdated IT skills. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.